Chapter 8 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 8. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 8, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 8, Missouri Radicals and Conservatives. Lincoln's determination to keep out of the quarrel in Missouri soon became practically impossible to carry out. Such a thorough change of political sentiment was being wrought by the local civil war in that state that every incident, whether of success or failure, served for the moment only to aggravate strife and bitterness. Out of the underlying suspicion and hostility between secessionists and Unionists, there grew the scarcely less strained and uncomfortable suspicion and rivalry between the new parties into which the people divided themselves. For nearly 2 years, these rival parties, first called Claybanks and Charcoals, and afterwards Conservatives and Radicals, gave President Lincoln little rest. They showered him with letters and besieged him with committees and delegations. Their complaints and protests touched every detail of civil and military administration in the state. They could neither agree upon a policy to be pursued, nor upon persons to execute it. Forced at length to intervene, Lincoln wrote on May 11, 1863, to the Secretary of War, "I have again concluded to relieve General Curtis. I see no other way to avoid the worst consequences there. I think of General Schofield as his successor, but I do not wish to take the matter of a successor out of the hands of yourself and General Halleck." This reference shows with what constant prudence he kept himself in harmony with his immediate subordinates, who also as a rule recognized and confirmed the wisdom of his actions. "You owe your present appointment entirely to the choice of the President himself," wrote Halleck to Schofield. "I have not directly or indirectly interfered in the matter, but I fully concur in the choice." The formal order of assignment was made on the 13th. When the rumor of the change reached the Radical leaders at St. Louis, they hastened to ask the suspension of Schofield's appointment. But Lincoln replied in the following emphatic telegram: "Your dispatch of today is just received. It is very painful to me that you in Missouri cannot or will not settle your factional quarrel among yourselves. I have been tormented with it beyond endurance for months by both sides. Neither side pays the least respect to my appeals to your reason. I am now compelled to take hold of the case." While he rarely used other than gentle words and kind phraseology, the telegram shows us that he could also speak with strong decision, and this tone he afterwards maintained substantially throughout the Missouri quarrel. His instructions to General Schofield on May 27th are characteristic of the underlying energy of will with which he met his more important difficulties. "Having relieved General Curtis and assigned to you the command of the Department of the Missouri, I think it may be of some advantage for me to state to you why I did it. I did not relieve General Curtis because of any full conviction that he had done wrong, by commission or omission. I did it because of a conviction in my mind that the Union men of Missouri, constituting when united a vast majority of the whole people, have entered into a pestilent factional quarrel among themselves. General Curtis, perhaps not of choice, being the head of one faction, and Governor Gamble that of the other. After months of labor to reconcile the difficulty, it seemed to grow worse and worse, until I felt it my duty to break it up somehow, and as I could not remove Governor Gamble, I had to remove General Curtis. Now that you are in the position, I wish you to undo nothing merely because General Curtis or Governor Gamble did it, but to exercise your own judgment and do right for the public interest. Let your military measures be strong enough to repel the invader and keep the peace, and not so strong as to unnecessarily harass and persecute the people. It is a difficult role, and so much greater will be the honor if you perform it well. If both factions, or neither, shall abuse you, you will probably be about right. Beware of being assailed by one and praised by the other." In accepting this appointment to his second command in Missouri, General Schofield promised to act in the spirit of the President's letter, and, as far as possible, to reconcile Missouri differences, and this promise he appears to have earnestly endeavored to fulfill. One of his first tasks related to the delicate question of Missouri emancipation. Prior events had so far advanced this issue that both parties recognized the main question as being already decided. The secondary and only remaining question was to find some mode of tempering the impending social and political change. In the late session of the legislature, this feeling had already found expression, the Conservatives promoting a measure to reconvene the existing Missouri Convention to initiate emancipation, while the Radicals labored for a bill to secure the election of an entirely new convention. Both measures failed, however, and this left to Governor Gamble, as leader of the Conservatives, the opportunity to initiate the contest for 1863, which he did by his proclamation of April 15th, calling the old convention to meet on the 15th of June. His personal course was very prudent. While his message distinctly endorsed emancipation as necessary for the public good, he refrained from recommending any given scheme, and advised concession and harmony in details. And assuming that the revolutionary urgency upon which the convention had appointed him provisional governor had now happily passed, he announced his resignation as such, to take effect on the last day of the session. But the convention refused to accept his resignation, and by a test vote of 47 to 34, requested him to, "continue to exercise the powers and discharge the duties of the office of governor of this State until the first Monday in November, 1864, and until his successor is elected and qualified." Meanwhile, President Lincoln had received from General Schofield the following inquiry: "The action of the Missouri State Convention upon the question of emancipation will depend very much upon whether they can be assured that their action will be sustained by the General Government, and the people protected in their slave property during the short time that slavery is permitted to exist. Am I authorized in any manner, directly or indirectly, to pledge such support and protection?" To this President Lincoln replied on June 22, "My dear Sir, your dispatch asking in substance whether, in case Missouri shall adopt gradual emancipation, the General Government will protect slave owners in that species of property during the short time it shall be permitted by the State to exist within it, has been received. Desirous as I am that emancipation shall be adopted by Missouri, and believing as I do that gradual can be made better than immediate for both black and white, except when military necessity changes the case, my impulse is to say that such protection would be given. I cannot know exactly what shape an act of emancipation may take. If the period from the initiation to the final end should be comparatively short, and the act should prevent persons being sold during that period into more lasting slavery, the whole would be easier. I do not wish to pledge the General Government to the affirmative support of even temporary slavery beyond what can be fairly claimed under the Constitution. I suppose, however, this is not desired, but that it is desired for the military force of the United States, while in Missouri, to not be used in subverting the temporarily reserved legal rights in slaves during the progress of emancipation. This I would desire also. I have very earnestly urged the slave States to adopt emancipation, and it ought to be, and is, an object with me not to overthrow or thwart what any of them may in good faith do to that end. You are, therefore, authorized to act in the spirit of this letter in conjunction with what may appear to be the military necessities of your department. Although this letter will become public at some time, it is not intended to be made so now." With this decided advantage of the President's known sympathy, the conservative members of the convention frittered away their opportunity to perform a transcendent act of benefit to their State and of honor to themselves. They indeed devised and adopted a scheme of emancipation, but it was one which, in the new condition of public opinion, seemed vitiated with a spirit of selfishness and an afterthought of evasion. The ordinance adopted provided in substance that slavery should cease in Missouri in the year 1870, and prohibited sales to non-residents after that date, provided that all slaves so emancipated should remain in servitude, those over 40 years of age during their lives, those under 12 until they became 23, and all others until July 4, 1876. Thus, the institution of slavery in Missouri would have remained untouched for the period of 7 years, with, of course, the contingent possibility of a change of public sentiment and a repeal of the ordinance before any right to freedom could accrue. Neither of the two desirable points mentioned by Mr. Lincoln in his letter to Schofield were embodied in it. The period of postponement was long, and no provision was made to prevent slaves being sold out of the State in the interim. Another objectionable provision was that slave property was exempted from all further taxation. It was not to be expected that such a dilatory and half-hearted measure as this would receive popular acceptance. This ordinance of emancipation was passed on the 1st of July, 1863, by a vote of 51 ayes to 30 noes. It was the last day of the session, and the convention took no further action except to receive from Governor Gamble a withdrawal of his previously tendered resignation, which it had declined to accept, after which it adjourned sine die. Except in the failure to which we have adverted, few State conventions have had so remarkable and so honorable a history. Its election took place under the revolutionary design that it should declare Missouri out of the Union. On the contrary, it remained firmly loyal, and after 5 sessions, during 3 of which it exercised the duties of ordinary legislation, it terminated its labors by prospectively destroying slavery. Passing from insurrection to emancipation, it signally reversed the ordinary rule that revolutions never go backwards. No sooner had the Constitutional Convention adjourned, July 1, 1863, than a popular movement of protest and opposition was begun by the radical emancipationists of St. Louis, which was pushed with such vigor and success that 2 months later, September 1st, delegates from 4/5 of the counties of Missouri met at Jefferson City in a radical emancipation convention. Footnote. Readers not skilled in American politics need to be reminded that the word convention, used in this chapter, has 2 meanings, being applied on one hand to a parliamentary body of delegates chosen under state laws, with authority to change or amend the state constitution, usually subject to ratification by a vote of the people. The more proper name for this is constitutional convention. On the other hand, when delegates of a political party, selected without any legal authority, under merely self-imposed party rules, meet to nominate candidates or to pass resolutions, the assemblage is called a convention, though it would be more strictly accurate to call it a party convention. End footnote. The political action which brought this convention together was greatly accelerated by one of those atrocities which sprang from the unrestrained passions of guerrilla war. Since the fall of Vicksburg, many rebel soldiers had returned from Arkansas to their homes in western Missouri, and under the secret orders so frequently sent from commanders in the South into that State, the guerrilla bands along the Kansas border suddenly grew in numbers and audacity. Though the whole region was patrolled almost day and night by Union detachments and scouts, a daring leader named Quantrell, who had been for some weeks threatening various Kansas towns, assembled a band of 300 picked and well-mounted followers at a place of rendezvous near the line about sunset of August 20th. His object being defined, half a dozen Union detachments from different points started in chase of him, but skillfully eluding them all by an eccentric march, Quantrell crossed the state line, and, reaching the open prairie country, where roads were unnecessary, pushed directly for Lawrence, Kansas. Every accident favored the invaders. When they were yet 25 or 30 miles away, a friendly messenger, riding at full speed in advance, sought to gain the town and give warning, but the horse fell and was killed, and his rider died next day from the injury he received. This town was 40 miles in the interior, and had no reason to apprehend an attack, and though it could have assembled several hundred men under arms in half an hour, its inhabitants had no dream of danger when the marauders entered the place at sunrise of August 21st. Quantrell stationed detachments to prevent any assembling or concentration of the citizens, and then began a scene of pillage, arson, and massacre too horrible to relate. Stores and banks were robbed, 185 buildings burned, and from 150 to 200 inhabitants murdered with a cold-blooded fiendishness which seems impossible to believe of Americans. The direful work occupied but 3 or 4 hours, when the perpetrators remounted their horses and departed. Though they managed their retreat with such skill as to avoid a general encounter, the pursuit was so hot that in several skirmishes, and by cutting off stragglers and laggards, 100 or more of the band were killed. The sudden calamity raised excitement on the Kansas border to almost a frenzy. A public meeting was held at Leavenworth, and the 8th of September was suggested for a general rising to enter Missouri to recover stolen property, a phrase easy to be translated into summary retaliation. Against this lawless proposal, however, General Schofield immediately took decided ground. "You cannot expect me to permit anything of this sort," he wrote to the governor of Kansas. "My present duty requires me to prevent it at all hazards, and by all the means in my power." At the same time, he assured the governor that he would make every effort to punish the perpetrators of the Lawrence massacre, and to afford all possible security for the future, and a satisfactory cooperation for this purpose was agreed upon by them and carried out. It was amid the excitement over this event that the Radical Union Emancipation Convention met at Jefferson City. This body took not only an extreme, but even a threatening attitude. Its resolutions broadly supported the President's general policy of suppressing the rebellion and his proclamation of military emancipation, but they complained of the local military administration of General Schofield, and asked the President to remove him and appoint General Butler or some other suitable man in his place. They complained more especially of the policy and action of Governor Gamble and the provisional government of the State, which they charged with aiding the pro-slavery faction and paralyzing the Federal power in suppressing the rebellion. They not only demanded the resignations of Governor Gamble and Lieutenant Governor Hall, but, seizing upon the occurrence of Quantrell's massacre in Kansas as a justification, adopted the following bold resolution: "Resolved, that in view of the serious complications that are arising out of hostilities on the part of the provisional State government to the national authority and the national policies, and the absence of protection from inroads from guerrilla bands, we hereby instruct the President of this Convention to appoint a General Committee of Public Safety, composed of 1 from each congressional district, whose duty it shall be to confer with the loyal men of this State, to organize and arm them for the protection of their homes, and in the event of no relief being obtained from our present troubles, to call upon the people of this State to act in their sovereign capacity and take such measures of redress as shall be found necessary for their welfare." The language was artfully framed. Literally construed, it merely called for protection against guerrillas and bushwhackers, but it required no great stretch of interpretation for an excited partisan to imagine that the provisional government was the real culprit to which its meaning pointed. Their resolutions also asked that General Schofield should authorize the recruitment of the negroes of disloyal owners for military service, that the legislature should provide for the election of a new State convention to act on the subject of emancipation, and finally provided that a committee of 1 from each county should be appointed to visit President Lincoln and lay their grievances before him. By way of anticipation, the visit of this committee to the President may be at once described. They came to Washington to the number of 70 on September 27th, and spent 2 days in preparing a formal address and arranging the necessary preliminaries to make their interview as impressive as possible. A number of delegates from the State of Kansas also appeared in Washington at the same time, with similar views and objects, and joined in the interview and address. Their independent attitude and language were reported to the President by apprehensive friends. They gave out that the Missouri Conservatives were only waiting a favorable opportunity to pronounce against him, that the Radicals would certainly carry the State in the next election, and that, to use their own expression, it was for the President to decide whether he would ride in their wagon or not. All this, however, had no effect upon Mr. Lincoln, who understood perfectly that the object of the delegation and Radical leaders was to procure the removal of General Schofield. "If," said he, "they can show that Schofield has done anything wrong, or has interfered to their disadvantage with State politics, or has so acted as to damage the cause of the Union and good order, their case is made." But he believed that the general had incurred their ill will simply by refusing to take sides with them. "I think," said he, "I understand this matter perfectly, and I cannot do anything contrary to my convictions to please these men, earnest and powerful as they may be." On the 30th of September, Senator Lane of Kansas brought his little army, as he styled it, to the Executive Mansion, and ranged it along 3 sides of the East Room, an assemblage of representative men from 2 frontier States, remarkable, however, more for sincere earnestness, and a bearing evincing stubborn determination to get what they considered their rights, than for either high average intelligence or adroitness. It was a compact phalanx of devoted political soldiers, officered by a few leaders of great ability. Mr. Lincoln never appeared to better advantage than in this interview, which lasted something over 2 hours, partly spent in speech making and partly in desultory talk. Though the President well knew how great the danger was to his political hopes from the unreasoning anger of the committee, he never cringed to them for an instant. The chairman, the Hon. C. D. Drake of St. Louis, impressively read their long studied address, and though no reporters were present, one of the President's secretaries took full notes of his reply, from which we have room to quote only a small portion. Said he, "It would not be consistent, either with a proper respect for you or a fair consideration of the subject involved, to give you a hasty answer. I will take your address, carefully consider it, and respond at my earliest convenience. I shall consider it without partiality for, or prejudice against, any man or party. No painful memories of the past, and no hopes for the future, personal to myself, shall hamper my judgment." The President then took up their points of complaint in detail. He told them that while they did not appear to relish his having characterized their troubles in Missouri as a pestilent factional quarrel, Governor Gamble liked it a great deal less; that Gamble had been chosen governor by their own State Convention, seemingly with the universal consent of the Union people of the State; that he, the President, had uniformly refused to give the Governor exclusive control of the Missouri State militia; that, on the other hand, the enrolled militia existed solely under State laws with which he had no right to interfere either in Missouri or elsewhere; and if that organization were inconsistent with their State laws, he as President had no power over it. He was sorry that they had not been more specific in their complaints about Schofield. They had only accused him vaguely of sympathy with their enemies. "I cannot," continued he, "act on vague impressions. Show me that he has disobeyed orders; show me that he has done something wrong, and I will take your request for his removal into serious consideration. He has never protested against an order, never neglected a duty with which he has been entrusted, so far as I know. When General Grant was struggling in Mississippi and needed reinforcements, no man was so active and efficient in sending him troops as General Schofield. I know nothing to his disadvantage. I am not personally acquainted with him. I have with him no personal relations. If you will allege a definite wrongdoing, and, having clearly made your point, prove it, I shall remove him. You object to his order on my recent proclamation suspending the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. I am at a loss to see why an order executing my official decree should be made a ground of accusation to me against the officer issuing it. You object to its being used in Missouri. In other words, that which is right when employed against opponents is wrong when employed against yourselves. Still, I will consider that. You object to his muzzling the press. As to that, I think when an officer in any department finds that a newspaper is pursuing a course calculated to embarrass his operations and stir up sedition and tumult, he has the right to lay hands upon it and suppress it, but in no other case. I approved the order in question after the Missouri Democrat had also approved it. Here an unwary delegate replied, "We thought then it was to be used against the other side." Lincoln: "Certainly you did. Your ideas of justice seem to depend on the application of it. You have spoken of the consideration which you think I should pay to my friends as contradistinguished from my enemies. I suppose, of course, that you mean by that those who agree or disagree with me in my views of public policy. I recognize no such thing as a political friendship personal to myself. You will remember that your State was excluded from the operations of that decree by its express terms. A proclamation, therefore, can have no direct bearing upon your State politics. Yet you seem to insist that it shall be made as vital a question as if it had. You seem to be determined to have it executed there. Delegate: No, sir, but we think it is a national test question. Lincoln: You are then determined to make an issue with men who may not agree with you upon the abstract question of the propriety of that act of mine. Now, let me say that I, who issued the proclamation, after more thought on the subject than probably any one of you has been able to give it, believe it to be right and expedient. I am better satisfied with those who believe with me in this than with those who hold differently. But I am free to say that many good men, some earnest Republicans, and some from very far north, were opposed to the issuing of that proclamation, holding it unwise and of doubtful legality. Now, when you see a man loyally in favor of the Union, willing to vote men and money, spending his time and money, and throwing his influence into the recruitment of our armies, I think it ungenerous, unjust, and impolitic to make his views on abstract political questions a test of his loyalty. I will not be a party to this application of a pocket inquisition." In the desultory talk which followed the speech-making, Mr. Lincoln was as fair and as firm on all collateral points and issues, meeting every statement of grievance with a quick counter-statement, so brief and so clinching that the several volunteer spokesmen who came forward to support the main address retired, one by one, disconcerted and overwhelmed. The interview finally closed with a little rejoinder from him, intended more especially for the marplots in the delegation. After stating that he appreciated perfectly the difference between the ultimate value of conservatives and radicals in the long controversy, he continued, "My radical friends will therefore see that I understand and appreciate their position. Still you appear to come before me as friends if I agree with you, and not otherwise. I do not here speak of mere personal friendship. When I speak of my friends, I mean those who are friendly to my measures, to the policy of the Government. I am well aware that by many, by some even among this delegation, I shall not name them, I have been in public speeches and in printed documents charged with tyranny and willfulness, with a disposition to make my own personal will supreme. I do not intend to be a tyrant. At all events, I shall take care that in my own eyes I do not become one. I have no right to act the tyrant to mere political opponents. If a man votes for supplies of men and money, encourages enlistments, discourages desertions, does all in his power to carry the war on to a successful issue, I have no right to question him for his abstract political opinions. I must make a dividing line somewhere between those who are the opponents of the Government and those who only approve peculiar features of my administration while they sustain the Government." These sentences from the President's talk to the delegation sufficiently show us his inflexibly fair dealing in the face of strong temptation. He knew that a certain unreasoning radicalism which pervaded the whole North might, and probably would, range itself behind this unreasonable radicalism of these Missourians. Besides this, while deploring the error of their present policy, he had a sincere respect for, and faith in, their undying political convictions. "I believe, after all," he said some weeks later, "those Missouri radicals will carry their State, and I do not object to it. They are nearer to me than the other side in thought and sentiment, though bitterly hostile personally. They are the unhandiest fellows in the world to deal with, but, after all, their faces are set Zionward." The real termination of the incident came with the formal reply which Mr. Lincoln addressed to the Hon. Charles D. Drake and others, committee, under date of October 5, 1863, and in which the President draws a picture of the confusion and terror of civil war, which we believe no pen has surpassed. "Your original address, presented on the 30th ultimo, and the 4 supplementary ones, presented on the 3d instant, have been carefully considered. I hope you will regard the other duties claiming my attention, together with the great length and importance of these documents, as constituting a sufficient apology for my not having responded sooner. These papers, framed for a common object, consist of the things demanded and the reasons for demanding them. The things demanded are, first, that General Schofield shall be relieved and General Butler be appointed as commander of the military department of Missouri. Second, that the system of enrolled militia in Missouri may be broken up, and national forces be substituted for it. and third, that at elections persons may not be allowed to vote who are not entitled by law to do so. Among the reasons given, enough of suffering and wrong to Union men is certainly, and I suppose truly, stated. Yet the whole case, as presented, fails to convince me that General Schofield, or the enrolled militia, is responsible for that suffering and wrong. The whole can be explained on a more charitable, and, as I think, a more rational hypothesis. We are in civil war. In such cases there is always a main question, but in this case that question is a perplexing compound, union and slavery. It thus becomes a question not of two sides merely, but of at least four sides, even among those who are for the Union, saying nothing of those who are against it. Thus those who are for the Union with but not without slavery, those for it without but not with, those for it with or without but prefer with, and those for it with or without but prefer it without. Among these again is a subdivision of those who are for gradual but not for immediate, and those who are for immediate but not for gradual extinction of slavery. It is easy to conceive that all these shades of opinion, and even more, may be sincerely entertained by honest and truthful men. Yet all being for the Union, by reason of these differences, each will prefer a different way of sustaining the Union. At once, sincerity is questioned, and motives are assailed. Actual war coming, blood grows hot and blood is spilled. Thought is forced from old channels into confusion. Deception breeds and thrives. Confidence dies, and universal suspicion reigns. Each man feels an impulse to kill his neighbor, lest he be first killed by him. Revenge and retaliation follow, and all this, as before said, may be among honest men only. But this is not all. Every foul bird comes abroad, and every dirty reptile rises up. These add crime to confusion. Strong measures, deemed indispensable but harsh at best, such men make worse by maladministration. Murders for old grudges, and murders for pelf, proceed under any cloak that will best cover for the occasion. These causes amply account for what has occurred in Missouri, without ascribing it to the weakness or wickedness of any general. The newspaper files, those chroniclers of current events, will show that the evils now complained of were quite as prevalent under Fremont, Hunter, Halleck, and Curtis as under Schofield. If the former had greater force opposed to them, they also had greater force with which to meet it. When the organized rebel army left the State, the main Federal force had to go also, leaving the department commander at home relatively no stronger than before. Without disparaging any, I affirm with confidence that no commander of that department has, in proportion to his means, done better than General Schofield." Proceeding then to examine with minuteness and answer with great patience such specific points of complaint as could be gleaned from the papers presented by the committee, the President's letter continued, "With my present views I must decline to remove General Schofield. In this I decide nothing against General Butler. I sincerely wish it were convenient to assign him a suitable command. In order to meet some existing evils, I have addressed a letter of instructions to General Schofield, a copy of which I enclose to you. As to the enrolled militia, I shall endeavor to ascertain, better than I now know, what is its exact value. Let me say now, however, that your proposal to substitute national forces for the enrolled militia implies that in your judgment the latter is doing something which needs to be done, and if so, the proposition to throw that force away and to supply its place by bringing other forces from the field, where they are urgently needed, seems to me very extraordinary. Whence shall they come? Shall they be withdrawn from Banks, or Grant, or Steele, or Rosecrans? Few things have been so grateful to my anxious feeling as when, in June last, the local force in Missouri aided General Schofield to so promptly send a large general force to the relief of General Grant, then investing Vicksburg, and menaced from without by General Johnston. Was this all wrong? Should the enrolled militia then have been broken up and General Herron kept from Grant to police Missouri? So far from finding cause to object, I confess to a sympathy for whatever relieves our general force in Missouri and allows it to serve elsewhere. I therefore, as at present advised, cannot attempt the destruction of the enrolled militia of Missouri. I may add that the force being under the national military control, it is also within the proclamation in regard to the habeas corpus. I concur in the propriety of your request in regard to elections, and have, as you see, directed General Schofield accordingly. I do not feel justified to enter upon the broad field you present in regard to the political differences between radicals and conservatives. From time to time I have done and said what appeared to me proper to do and say. The public knows it all. It obliges nobody to follow me, and I trust it obliges me to follow nobody. The radicals and conservatives each agree with me in some things and disagree in others. I could wish both to agree with me in all things, for then they would agree with each other, and would be too strong for any foe from any quarter. They, however, choose to do otherwise, and I do not question their right. I, too, shall do what seems to be my duty. I hold whoever commands in Missouri or elsewhere responsible to me, and not to either radicals or conservatives. It is my duty to hear all, but at last I must, within my sphere, judge what to do and what to forbear." The very radical announcements authoritatively made by so large and so representative a gathering as the convention which appointed the delegation whose visit to the President we have described, on the whole rather tended to produce a reaction in local opinion. The conservatives had all along been accusing the radical leaders of harboring unlawful and revolutionary designs. Reckless speakers, and particularly reckless newspapers of that party, had indeed, during the whole year, been calling for the overthrow or displacement of the Missouri Provisional Government, with all its machinery of civil administration, and especially its State and enrolled militia, by a sweeping assumption of federal military power. Now, when this extensive and influential political gathering vaguely proposed some such action through a Committee of Public Safety, and an organizing and arming of those who chose to call themselves loyal men, the menace began to look serious under whatever pretext it might be put forth. It served at least to bring the various questions in controversy to a sharper issue. Under date of September 20th, General Schofield transmitted to Washington a collection of inflammatory newspaper articles, with a report that, "the revolutionary faction which has so long been striving to gain the ascendancy in Missouri, particularly in St. Louis, to overthrow the present State government and change the policy of the national administration, has at length succeeded so far as to produce open mutiny of one of the militia regiments and serious difficulties in others." He also enclosed an order published by him on September 17th, announcing that martial law would be enforced against persons encouraging mutiny, exciting insurrection by uttering or publishing falsehoods or misrepresentations, and that newspapers violating the order would be suppressed. "I am thoroughly convinced," he added, "of the necessity for prompt and decided measures to put down this revolutionary scheme, and my sense of duty will not permit me to delay it longer." Called upon to act in what seemed a critical emergency, President Lincoln, notwithstanding a great outcry from the radical press, under date of September 26th sent the general his written approval of the order, and on the 1st of October wrote him a letter adding a number of prudential suggestions as to the spirit and manner in which he wished the order to be carried out. It is written in such a tone of judicious firmness, and contains at the same time so much valuable admonition in regard to the details of the general's duty, that we cannot refrain from quoting the greater part of it. "There is no organized military force in avowed opposition to the general government now in Missouri, and if any such shall reappear, your duty in regard to it will be too plain to require any special instruction. Still the condition of things, both there and elsewhere, is such as to render it indispensable to maintain for a time the United States military establishment in that State, as well as to rely upon it for a fair contribution of support to that establishment generally. Your immediate duty in regard to Missouri now is to advance the efficiency of that establishment, and to so use it, as far as practicable, to compel the excited people there to leave one another alone. Under your recent order, which I have approved, you will only arrest individuals and suppress assemblies or newspapers when they may be working palpable injury to the military in your charge, and in no other case will you interfere with the expression of opinion in any form, or allow it to be interfered with violently by others. In this you have a discretion to exercise with great caution, calmness, and forbearance. With the matters of removing the inhabitants of certain counties en masse, and of removing certain individuals from time to time who are supposed to be mischievous, I am not now interfering, but am leaving to your own discretion. Nor am I interfering with what may still seem to you to be unnecessary restrictions upon trade and intercourse. I think proper, however, to enjoin upon you the following. Allow no part of the military under your command to be engaged in either returning fugitive slaves, or enforcing and enticing slaves from their homes, and, so far as practicable, enforce the same forbearance upon the people. At elections, see that those, and only those, are allowed to vote who are entitled to do so by the laws of Missouri, including, as of those laws, the restrictions laid by the Missouri Convention upon those who may have participated in the rebellion. So far as practicable, you will, by means of your military force, expel guerrillas, marauders, and murderers, and all who are known to harbor, aid, or abet them. But, in like manner, you will repress assumptions of unauthorized individuals to perform the same service, because under pretense of doing this, they become marauders and murderers themselves." But the President did not have General Schofield alone to advise and direct. Governor Gamble also had taken alarm at the attitude of menace which the Radical leaders had allowed their followers to assume. On this same 1st of October he wrote a letter to the President, in which he recalled that as provisional governor of Missouri he had exhausted the resources of the State in maintaining the supremacy of the Federal Government, and he now demanded in turn that the President should order the general commanding this department to maintain by all the force under his control the integrity of the State government. Following this official demand for protection, Governor Gamble also, on the 12th of October, issued a long proclamation to the people of his State, in which he embodied a strong and convincing reply to the accusations of disloyalty which had been leveled against him, reciting his many and continuous official duties and his fidelity to the Union cause and Federal Government, and his willingness and efforts as a member of the State Convention to secure and complete emancipation at as early a date as 1867. He called attention to the fact that he had voluntarily tendered his resignation of his office as provisional governor, and while still declaring, "that no object is here intended to be suggested to any change in their government, which the people may think proper to make by peaceful means in accordance with the Constitution and laws," he nevertheless warned all persons "against any attempt to effect a change by means of violence," and announced his intention to employ "all the force I can command to sustain the laws, preserve the peace of the State, and punish those who disturb it." It was a document so clear in its statements, and so quiet and firm in its tone, as to appeal to the good sense and moderation of all except those intent upon mischief. About a week later, October 19th, President Lincoln sent his reply to the Governor's official demand for protection to the provisional government, and as his letter was written with such skill and discrimination in the perplexing complications which it called forth, it requires to be read in full. "Yours of the 1st instant was duly received, and I have delayed so long to answer it because of other pressing duties, because it did not appear to me that the domestic violence you apprehend was very imminent, and because, if it were so imminent, my direction to General Schofield embraces very nearly the extent of my power to repress it. Being instructed to repress all violence, of course he will, so far as in his power, repress any which may be offered to the State government. At the beginning of our present troubles, the regularly installed State officers of Missouri, taking sides with the rebellion, were forced to give way to the provisional State government, at the head of which you stand, and which was placed in authority, as I understood, by the unanimous action and acquiescence of the Union people of the State. I have seen no occasion to make a distinction against the provisional government because of its not having been chosen and inaugurated in the usual way, nor have I seen any cause to suspect it of unfaithfulness to the Union. So far as I have yet considered, I am as ready, on a proper case being made, to give the State the constitutional protection against invasion and domestic violence under the provisional government as I would be if it were under a government installed in the ordinary manner. I have not thought of making a distinction. In your proclamation of the 12th instant, you state the proposition substantially that no objection can be made to any change in the State government which the people may desire to make, so far as the end can be effected by means conforming to the Constitution and laws through the expression of the popular will, but that such change should not be effected by violence. I concur in this, and I may add that it makes precisely the distinction I wish to keep in view. In the absence of such violence, or imminent danger thereof, it is not proper for the national executive to interfere, and I am unwilling, by any formal action, to show an appearance of belief that there is such imminent danger before I really believe there is. I might thereby, to some extent, bear false witness. You tell me a party has sprung up in Missouri which openly and loudly proclaims the purpose to overthrow the provisional government by violence. Does the party so proclaim, or is it only that some members of the party so proclaim? If I mistake not, the party alluded to recently held a State convention and adopted resolutions. Did they therein declare violence against the provisional State government? No party can be justly held responsible for what individual members of it may say or do. Nothing in this letter is written with reference to any State which may have maintained within it no State government professedly loyal to the United States." The serious lengths to which the Missouri controversy had run, Schofield's order against sedition, the Governor's proclamation against treason to the State, and President Lincoln's approval of both, with qualifying advice, served at last to check and moderate factional excitement and exasperation. Following the President's suggestions, General Schofield exercised great forbearance in enforcing his order and in general administration. He submitted to the President a plan and recommendation gradually to dispense with the enrolled militia, which he characterized as "some being very good and others very bad," though by reason of their local knowledge they had rendered efficient service. He partly satisfied anti-slavery clamor by permitting negroes to be recruited under careful restrictions. He issued an order impartially regulating and enforcing the laws and ordinances of the State Convention applicable to the coming election of November 3, 1863. He was so fortunate also as to frustrate and repel a raid of the rebels under Shelley into the State, and to chase Quantrell and others out with them. On October 25th he wrote to the President, "My radical friends now exhibit some disposition to stop their war on me, and I shall not certainly give them any good reason for continuing it. I have enforced my order in only one case, and that so clear that the offender freely confessed, and asked pardon on any terms. It will not probably be necessary for me to exercise any control over their press hereafter. Your accurate appreciation of the real difficulty here, and the strong and generous manner in which you have sustained me, will do more good in Missouri than to have doubled the troops under my command." And a little later he was further able to report, "The late election in all parts of the State passed off in perfect quiet and good order. I have heard of no disturbance of any kind anywhere." At the election, the Radicals gained a slight apparent victory, the soldiers' vote especially supporting their ticket with a near approach to unanimity, and this result tended still farther to prevent for the time being active and adverse criticism of General Schofield's administration. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Owen Cook in Pottawatomie Ceded Land.